Jonathan Roumie was moving fast, his head slightly lowered, trying to slip past the crowd without drawing attention. It had been a long day, one of those days where the weight of portraying Jesus didn't fade when the cameras stopped rolling. Fans surrounded him, voices overlapping, phones raised, calling his name. "Jonathan! Jesus! Can we get a picture?" He smiled politely, nodding as he walked, his body tired but his heart still heavy with the scenes he had just filmed. He wasn't prepared for what happened next. Suddenly, a voice cut through the noise, not loud, not demanding, but steady. "Please, wait." Roumie stopped. The crowd quieted slightly as people turned to see who had spoken. In front of him was a man in a wheelchair. His hands rested calmly in his lap. His eyes weren't filled with excitement or awe, but with something deeper. Something serious. For a moment, no one spoke. People assumed the man wanted an autograph. Some expected a photo. Others thought he would say something religious. Instead, the man looked up at Roumie and said words that would stay with him forever. "I need you to know something, before you go." Roumie leaned in, instinctively lowering himself to be at eye level. He didn't know why, but something about this moment felt different. The man took a breath. "When I watch you play Jesus," he said slowly, "I don't feel like I'm watching a show." The air seemed to change. "I feel like he finally notices me." Roumie froze. The crowd disappeared. The noise faded. There was only that sentence, hanging in the space between them. The man continued, his voice calm but heavy with years of pain. "I've spent my life being looked past. People talk over me, around me, like I'm not there. But when you look at people on that screen, you look like you would stop for someone like me." Roumie swallowed hard. His chest tightened. This wasn't a compliment. It wasn't admiration. It was a confession. And in that moment, Jonathan Roumie realized something that shook him to his core. Playing Jesus wasn't just about lines, scenes, or performance. For some people, it was the closest they had ever felt to being seen by God. And this conversation, this unexpected interruption, was only the beginning of a change that would follow him for the rest of his life. The filming day had started before sunrise. Jonathan Roumie arrived on set while the sky was still dark, the desert air cold against his skin. Crew members moved quietly, sipping coffee, checking equipment, preparing for another long day of filming The Chosen. For many of them, it was just another workday. For Roumie, it was something heavier. Every time he stepped into costume, something shifted inside him. The robes were simple, the sandals worn, the fabric rough against his hands. But the moment he put them on, people stopped seeing Jonathan. They saw Jesus. And that knowledge never left his mind, not for a second. That day's scenes were intense, emotional. Scenes where Jesus listened to suffering, where he paused, where he looked at people the world had pushed aside. Roumie poured everything into it. Each word spoken slowly, each silence carefully held. He didn't want to act compassion, he wanted to understand it. By the time the director finally called, "Cut," that's a wrap, the sun was already low in the sky. Jonathan felt drained. Not just physically, but spiritually. There was a strange exhaustion that came with playing Jesus. It wasn't the hours or the heat. It was the responsibility. He often wondered if he was worthy of the role. If he was doing it justice. If someone, somewhere, needed to see something real, and whether he was delivering it. As he walked off set, he loosened the costume, changed into his regular clothes, and tried to become himself again. But that separation was never clean. The character followed him. The words lingered. The faces from the scenes stayed with him. Outside, a small group of fans had gathered near the exit. They had waited patiently all day. Some held Bibles. Some held phones. Others simply stood quietly, hoping for a moment, any moment, with a man who had given a face and a voice to Jesus in a way they had never seen before. Jonathan hesitated. He wanted to stop for everyone. He always did. But he was exhausted, and the production team gently urged him along. Tomorrow was another early call time. Another demanding day. So he walked. He smiled. He nodded. He offered brief greetings. "God bless you. Thank you for watching. I appreciate you. He meant every word, but still, something felt unfinished. As he moved through the crowd, he noticed something he often did but rarely spoke about. People didn't just look at him like an actor. They looked at him like a bridge. Some had tears in their eyes. Some clasped their hands together as if in prayer. Some whispered thank yous, not to him, but to the image he represented. That was the part that unsettled him the most. Jonathan Roumie was a deeply faithful man, but he never wanted to replace faith with fandom. He feared being put on a pedestal. He feared misrepresenting something sacred. He feared that one wrong expression, one careless moment, could distract from the message rather than serve it. He carried those thoughts as he walked, until he heard the voice. Please, wait. He stopped, turned, and saw the man in the wheelchair. But before that moment, before the words were spoken, there was something else Jonathan noticed. No one was paying attention to him. People stepped around the wheelchair without malice, without cruelty, but without awareness. Conversations continued. Phones stayed raised. The crowd flowed past him like water around a stone. Jonathan felt a quiet discomfort. He thought of the scenes he had just filmed. Jesus stopping. Jesus kneeling. Jesus noticing the ones no one else did. And without fully understanding why, Jonathan slowed down. He stepped closer. He bent slightly, instinctively lowering himself to meet the man at eye level. That small movement, so simple, so natural, would later mean more to the man than Jonathan could ever imagine. At that moment, Jonathan still believed this was just another brief interaction. Another kind word exchanged before the night ended. Another moment of gratitude. He didn't know yet that this encounter would change how he approached every scene, every silence, every look from that day forward. He didn't know yet that the man before him would give him something no director ever could. Not instruction. Not critique. But truth. And the truth was about to reshape the way Jonathan Roumie understood the role he thought he already knew. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Jonathan Roumie stood there, slightly bent forward, his hands loosely at his sides. The crowd behind him hummed softly, whispers, footsteps, the faint click of phone cameras, but it all felt distant, muted, as if the moment had drawn a quiet circle around the two of them. The man in the wheelchair looked up at him, studying his face carefully. Not the face from the screen. Not the image framed by lighting and music. But the real one. You didn't have to stop, the man said finally. Jonathan smiled gently. I wanted to. That answer surprised even him. The man nodded slowly, as if confirming something to himself. His hands trembled just slightly as he adjusted them on his lap. Years of living in a body that did not cooperate had taught him patience, taught him how to wait, how to endure, how to be overlooked without complaint. I've watched The Chosen, he said. Every episode. Jonathan listened, fully present now. He had heard those words many times before. Usually they were followed by excitement, praise, or questions about future seasons. But something in the man's tone told him this was different. I don't watch it for entertainment, the man continued. I watch it because it gives me rest. Jonathan's brow furrowed slightly. Rest. The man smiled faintly. Yes. Rest from feeling invisible. That word landed hard. Invisible. I've been in this chair for most of my life, the man said. People don't mean to ignore me. They just do. They talk to whoever's standing with me. They push past me. They speak louder to others, softer to me. Sometimes not at all. Jonathan felt his chest tighten. He didn't interrupt. He didn't rush the silence. He let the man speak at his own pace. When I was younger, the man went on, I prayed every night to be healed. I believed with everything I had. When it didn't happen, I thought maybe I wasn't worth stopping for. Jonathan felt his throat close. The man looked down briefly, then back up. But when I watch you play Jesus, he stops. Jonathan followed his gaze instinctively, as if replaying scenes in his mind. Jesus pausing in a crowded street. Jesus kneeling. Jesus making eye contact with the overlooked. You don't rush past people like me, the man said. You look at them. You listen. You stay. Jonathan swallowed. I know you're an actor, the man added quickly. I know it's a show. But something about the way you hold the silence, the way you meet their eyes, it tells me something. He paused. It tells me I would have mattered to him. Jonathan felt tears threaten, and he blinked them back, not out of pride, but out of awe. He had never considered that a pause, a glance, a breath between lines could mean so much to someone he would never meet. I never thought about Jesus noticing me, the man continued softly. But now I can't unsee it. Jonathan finally spoke, his voice quieter than usual. Thank you for telling me. The man shook his head. No. Thank you for showing me. Around them, the crowd had fallen almost completely silent. Even those recording had lowered their phones, sensing something sacred unfolding. Jonathan took a small step closer. Can I ask you something? The man nodded. What would you want Jesus to know, if he were standing here? The man didn't answer right away. He looked down at his hands again. When he spoke, his voice trembled. I'd want him to know that being seen healed me more than walking ever could. Jonathan closed his eyes for a brief moment. In that instant, something shifted. This wasn't about performance anymore. It wasn't about accuracy or interpretation. It was about presence. Jonathan reached out gently and rested a hand on the man's arm, not as an actor, not as a symbol, but as a fellow human being. I promise you, Jonathan said, I will never forget this. The man smiled, his eyes shining. That's all I hoped for. Jonathan stood slowly, the weight of the encounter settling deep within him. As he stepped back, he realized something profound. Every scene he would film from this day forward would carry this moment within it. Every pause would matter. Every look would carry weight. Every act of compassion would be for someone like the man in the wheelchair, someone who just wanted to be seen. And though Jonathan Roumie walked away moments later, he knew the encounter had marked him permanently. Not because of fame, not because of praise, but because, in the quietest way possible, a man the world overlooked had reminded him how Jesus never would. Jonathan Roumie didn't speak much on the drive back that night. The city lights passed by the window in soft blurs, red and white streaks stretching into the darkness. His phone buzzed occasionally, messages from friends, notifications from social media, but he didn't look at it. His mind was somewhere else, replaying a moment that refused to fade. The man's words echoed again and again. Being seen healed me more than walking ever could. Jonathan rested his head lightly against the seat and closed his eyes. He had played dozens of scenes that day, delivered lines written months earlier, hit emotional beats carefully shaped by directors and editors. Yet none of it stayed with him the way those few unscripted sentences did. There was no camera, no lighting, no music swelling underneath. And yet, it felt more sacred than anything he had filmed. That night, sleep came slowly. When it did, it wasn't rest, it was reflection. He dreamed of crowded streets, of people calling out, of hands reaching toward him. In every dream, there were faces he hadn't noticed before. Faces at the edges. Faces waiting quietly. He woke before sunrise. Jonathan sat up in bed, the room still dark, the silence heavy. He reached for his Bible, not out of routine, but out of need. He didn't search for a passage. He let it fall open where it would. His eyes landed on a familiar verse, one he had read countless times. And Jesus stopped. Just 3 words. Jonathan stared at them for a long time. How many times had he spoken lines as Jesus without truly understanding that sentence? How many times had he focused on delivering the message while overlooking the miracle of the pause? Jesus stopped. Not because he was unaware of the crowd. Not because he lacked direction. But because someone mattered enough to interrupt his movement. Jonathan exhaled slowly. On set later that week, something was different. No one could quite name it. The crew went about their work as usual. Cameras rolled. Directors gave notes. Actors rehearsed their lines. But when Jonathan stepped into costume, there was a stillness about him that hadn't been there before. In one scene, Jesus crossed a busy street filled with voices and movement. The script called for him to pause briefly before speaking. Jonathan paused longer. No one called, "Cut." The silence stretched. Then the director quietly said, That was perfect. Jonathan hadn't planned it. He hadn't decided to change anything. He had simply remembered the man in the wheelchair. He had remembered what it meant to be noticed. Between takes, Jonathan found himself watching the background actors more closely. The ones standing at the edges of the frame. The ones meant to blend into the scenery. He made eye contact. He nodded. He smiled. It wasn't performance. It was practice. One afternoon, a young production assistant approached him nervously, apologizing for bumping into him earlier. Jonathan smiled. "You don't need to apologize. I see you." The assistant froze, then nodded, blinking back tears. Jonathan didn't think much of it at the time. But later, alone again, he realized something unsettling and beautiful all at once. The man in the wheelchair hadn't just changed how he played Jesus. He had changed how he lived. Weeks passed. Then months. Interviews came and went. Questions repeated. Praise followed him everywhere. But Jonathan's answers began to shift. Where once he spoke about preparation and research, he now spoke about listening. About silence. About responsibility. "Jesus noticed people," he said in one interview. "I'm learning to do the same." He never shared the man's name. Never told the story for attention. But he carried it into every role, every prayer, every interaction with a stranger who hesitated before speaking. Sometimes, after filming Wrapped, Jonathan would linger just a little longer. He would stop when someone called out, not the loudest voice, but the quietest one. He began to understand something deeply uncomfortable. Being busy is often just another way of being blind. One evening, standing alone on set after everyone had gone, Jonathan looked out at the empty space where crowds once stood during filming. He imagined the man in the wheelchair there, not as someone waiting, but as someone already seen. Jonathan whispered a quiet prayer. "Help me stop. Not slow down. Not perform better. But stop." Because now he knew what stopping could do. It could heal something unseen. It could restore dignity. It could reflect the heart of Jesus more clearly than any perfectly delivered line. The cameras would keep rolling. The seasons would continue. Millions would watch. But for Jonathan Roumie, the role had already changed forever. Not because of fame. Not because of success. But because one man, the world often overlooked, had shown him the power of a single holy pause. The change didn't arrive all at once. It settled slowly into Jonathan Roumie's life, like light entering a room at dawn, quiet, gentle, impossible to ignore once it was there. At first, it showed itself in the smallest ways. During rehearsals, Jonathan began asking fewer questions about how a line should sound and more about who it was meant for. Not the audience. Not the critics. But the person standing just outside the frame, the one who might be watching from a hospital bed, or a prison cell, or a lonely apartment late at night. He started thinking about the people who felt forgotten. The ones who didn't expect miracles anymore. The ones who had learned to live without being noticed. Every time the script called for Jesus to move through a crowd, Jonathan remembered the man in the wheelchair. He remembered the calm in his voice. The honesty. The way years of being overlooked had shaped him without hardening him. So Jonathan slowed down. He let his eyes linger. He allowed silence to breathe. He gave weight to moments that could have easily been rushed. And something unexpected happened. People began to feel it. Other actors noticed first. They couldn't quite explain it, but scenes felt different now. More grounded. More human. When Jonathan looked at them during a take, it didn't feel like acting. It felt like being truly present with another person. One actress pulled him aside after an emotional scene. "When you looked at me," she said quietly, "I forgot where I was." Jonathan nodded. He understood exactly what she meant. He wasn't trying to disappear into the role anymore. He was trying to let the role look outward. Off camera, the change deepened. Jonathan found himself stopping more often in daily life. In grocery stores. On sidewalks. At church. He noticed how many people carried stories in their eyes but rarely found someone willing to hear them. A man once stopped him after Mass, his hands shaking as he spoke. "My son hasn't spoken to me in years," the man said. "But when I watch the show, I feel like God hasn't given up on me." Jonathan listened. He didn't rush. He didn't offer answers. He stayed. And that, he had learned, was sometimes the holiest thing a person could do. The memory of the wheelchair-bound man never left him. It followed him into interviews, into prayer, into moments of doubt. Especially into doubt. There were days when the pressure felt overwhelming. Days when he worried about living up to expectations. Days when he feared failing the people who found hope in the character he portrayed. On those days, he remembered the sentence that changed everything. Being seen healed me more than walking ever could. It reminded him that his calling wasn't to be perfect. It was to be attentive. As seasons passed and the show reached millions across the world, Jonathan became increasingly careful with how he spoke about his role. He resisted grand statements. He avoided claiming authority. "I'm just trying to point people toward Jesus," he said in one interview. "Not replace him." But privately, he prayed differently now. He no longer asked, "How do I play this scene well?" He asked, "Who needs to be seen in this moment?" That question reshaped everything. It reshaped how he approached fame. How he handled praise. How he responded to criticism. When strangers thanked him for changing their faith, he redirected the credit gently. When others projected their expectations onto him, he met them with humility rather than defense. Because he understood something most people never do. Influence is dangerous when it forgets compassion. One evening, long after filming had ended for the season, Jonathan sat alone in a quiet chapel. Candles flickered softly. The room smelled of incense and old wood. He closed his eyes and imagined the faces of all the people who might be watching the show that very night. And among them, clearly, he saw the man in the wheelchair. Not as a symbol. Not as a story. But as a reminder. A reminder that the most Christ-like moments rarely happen on a stage. They happen when someone stops. When someone listens. When someone chooses presence over progress. Jonathan opened his eyes and smiled faintly. The role had changed him, but not by making him feel important. By making him feel responsible. Responsible to notice. Responsible to pause. Responsible to see. Jonathan Roumie never tried to turn the moment into a message. He never stood on a stage and told the story as proof of his faith or his sensitivity. In fact, he carried it quietly, like something too fragile to be used for applause. But over time, the legacy of that single encounter revealed itself, not through words, but through the way he moved through the world. People often think influence is loud. They imagine it looks like millions of viewers, standing ovations, trending clips, and endless praise. But Jonathan learned that real influence usually arrives without announcement. It comes in whispers, in pauses, in moments so small they could easily be missed. The man in the wheelchair never asked to change Jonathan Roumie's life. He didn't demand recognition. He didn't ask for healing. He didn't even ask for more time. He only spoke truth. And that truth settled into Jonathan's heart like a seed. Over the years, as The Chosen continued to reach audiences around the world, stories began to surface. Not about cinematic excellence or perfect performances, but about people who felt seen for the first time. A woman in a nursing home who said she no longer felt forgotten. A teenager struggling with faith who said the show made Jesus feel close, not distant. A man in prison who said the pauses between words mattered more than the words themselves. Jonathan listened to these stories carefully. He didn't collect them. He didn't showcase them. He received them with humility, knowing each one carried weight he could never fully understand. And always, in the quiet of his own thoughts, he returned to the same question. Who am I stopping for? Because that, he realized, was the heart of the gospel. Jesus didn't measure people by their usefulness, their status, or their visibility. He measured them by their humanity. He stopped for the ones the crowd moved past. He listened when others rushed ahead. He looked directly at those who had learned not to expect to be noticed. And now, Jonathan tried to do the same. Not as an actor. Not as a public figure. But as a person. The moral of the story wasn't about fame or faith or even art. It was about attention. In a world that rewards speed, productivity, and self-promotion, stopping feels almost rebellious. Listening feels inefficient. Seeing someone fully feels risky. But that is where transformation happens. The man in the wheelchair didn't walk away healed in the way many would expect. His circumstances didn't change overnight. His body remained the same. But something deeper had shifted. He felt seen. And that, Jonathan learned, was sometimes the miracle. We often wait for big moments to prove our character. Grand gestures. Public sacrifices. But more often than not, our character is revealed in the interruptions we resent, or the ones we welcome. Who do we slow down for? Who do we listen to when no one is watching? Who do we treat with dignity when there's nothing to gain? Those answers shape us far more than any role we play. Jonathan Roumie continues to portray Jesus on screen. Millions continue to watch. But the truest reflection of the role doesn't happen under lights or through scripts. It happens when he stops in a hallway. When he meets someone's eyes. When he chooses presence over performance. And perhaps that is the legacy that matters most. Not that he played Jesus convincingly, but that, in small ordinary ways, he learned to act like him. So the next time life feels rushed, and someone quietly asks for a moment, remember this story. Remember the power of stopping. Because you never know whose life might be changed, simply by being seen. Years from now, Jonathan Roumie may forget many details of the days spent on set. The long hours. The exact lines. The weight of the costume after a full day of filming. But he will never forget that moment. Not the cameras. Not the crowd. But a single voice that asked him to stop. The man in the wheelchair did not know the impact he would have. He did not plan to change how a man would approach the most important role of his life. He simply spoke honestly, from a place shaped by years of being overlooked. And sometimes, that is all it takes. One honest sentence. One quiet truth. One human connection. Jonathan Roumie often reflects on how easily that moment could have been missed. He could have kept walking. He could have waved politely and disappeared into the night. No one would have blamed him. No one would have noticed. But he stopped. And because he stopped, something eternal took root. This is where the story leaves the screen and steps into our lives. Because this isn't really a story about an actor or a television show. It's a story about attention. About humility. About what happens when we choose presence over comfort. Every day, we pass people who feel invisible. The elderly woman waiting quietly. The man whose disability makes others uncomfortable. The child who speaks softly and is rarely heard. The stranger who carries pain behind a practiced smile. They are not asking for miracles. They are asking to be seen. The world teaches us to rush. To prioritize what is loud, impressive, and urgent. It tells us our value is measured by productivity, success, and recognition. But the life of Jesus tells a different story. He stopped for the blind man while crowds shouted. He spoke with the woman others avoided. He noticed the ones who had learned not to hope. And that noticing, more than the miracles themselves, restored dignity. Jonathan Roumie learned that playing Jesus was never about imitation alone. It was about reflection. About allowing the character to shape the heart of the person portraying him. The role didn't make him holy. It made him aware. Aware of how often people are overlooked. Aware of how easily we confuse movement with meaning. Aware that sometimes the most Christ-like thing we can do is pause. And that awareness is now part of his legacy. Not just in the scenes that moved millions, but in the quiet choices no one will ever see. The choice to listen. The choice to slow down. The choice to treat interruptions as invitations. The man in the wheelchair may never appear in an interview. His name may never be known. But his impact will echo through every scene where Jesus pauses, every moment where compassion lingers, every look that communicates, you matter. And perhaps that is how real change always happens. Not through power. Not through recognition. But through humility. So as this story ends, it leaves us with a simple question, one that doesn't require fame, faith, or a platform to answer. Who will you stop for? Who will you notice when the world keeps moving? Because somewhere, someone is waiting, not for a miracle, but for a moment of dignity. And sometimes, that moment can change a life. Type respect if you believe humility is strength. Type amen if you believe being seen can heal. And wherever you're watching from, remember this. True power doesn't demand attention. It gives it.